Hello all, am I audible? I hope I am audible. Yes. Hi all, welcome to today's session. Today we are here to discuss about the topic EIA, that's our Environmental Impact Assessment Draft 2020, a comprehensive analysis. So today here we have with us a Professor of Public Policy from National Law School of India University, Professor Kshitij Aris. He is a medical graduate from Bangalore University. He has completed his Masters in Development Studies from SOAS University of London. He has been an activist and campaigner who has been actively working for the urban poor, homeless, and children since 1993. He is a founder member and a significant contributor to APSA ADSA, that's the Association for Promoting Social Activities. It's extensively working in Karnataka and Andhra Pradesh. It's an award-winning organization. He's a director of ANS iView. It's a grassroots level media center. He's a founder member of the campaign against water privatization in Karnataka. He was the regional head of ActionAid, and he's an advisor to and the leader of several prestigious organizations. It is with a great sense of responsibility and pleasure that I welcome Professor Kshitij Aris to be the speaker for the day on behalf of Kites Foundation and on behalf of all of you. Welcome, sir. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for that introduction, and it's my pleasure. It's a fairly somber issue that we are discussing today, but it's my pleasure to be with young people who have committed themselves in making a change, and that's extremely important. I have been working with young people for quite some time now. I founded a department called the Center for Social Action in Christ University. And the objective was to ensure that students go through an experiential learning process on socioeconomic issues of India. And it is also to ensure that students, young people emerge as protagonists for change, who demand for change, because I do believe in the tenet that it is eternal vigilance that can protect democracy. And to be eternally vigilant, people have to be active and involved on issues. So I'm really glad that there are so many people today afternoon who are part of this discussion on EIA. Having said that, I'm sure you know that today is the last day for the submission of your feedback to the EIA notification of 2020. But I also hear that there are lakhs of responses that have gone from across India. And I was also reading up that there are film stars from Tamil Nadu and Kerala who have written to the Environment Minister with their understanding of EIA being detrimental to the ecology in India. And this is a welcome change, because you have superstars who are otherwise fairly neutral, and as a matter of fact, very pro-establishment, who are able to understand what is happening with EIA notification 2020. So I was asked to do a comprehensive analysis of the EIA notification, but I'm sure because it's also a last day for the submission of feedback, you have already gone through quite a bit of what is being said about EIA, and so I would want to set a context, talk a little bit about the history of environmental laws and principles in India, as well as talk about EIA 2020. So you'll be able to contextualize it much better and be able to take a stand on it. So I'll take about 20-25 minutes to talk about this issue. And then I was told by Rajashri that she will open this up for discussion, and other people can also start chipping in. So to start with, it's the timing of it all which matters. The EIA notification was made public one day before the lockdown was announced. even if you assume that it was mere coincidence because a lockdown was being planned for quite some time and it was to happen, this coincidence of making the EIA public just the day before the lockdown was announced curtailed people's ability to communicate on the issue. And though there has been a spurt in technology of being able to connect with each other through electronic media, and you have so many of these apps which have quickly evolved and capitalized on the requirement of people to be in touch with each other. The absence of such technology in the initial phase also meant that people were not able to get in touch with each other. It also meant that those who are affected, directly impacted by environmental policies, as well as the projects that are approved to be taken up in distant areas in villages and in forests of India, don't have access to this technology at all. And so we cannot be blind to the fact that 65% of our population lives in villages, and not all of them have access to technology. So there is a differential access to technology which would prevent people from participating in a deliberation on the issue. The second issue is, of course, the pandemic itself. In a very welcome tone, both the WHO, the World Health Organization, and the United Nations at the senior-most leadership levels have said that this pandemic is largely because the buffer, not just the spatial buffer, but the spatial buffer too, the buffer between human beings and the natural world is increasingly getting eroded, which means that the policies in the world, I mean, there's not a single country in the world that you can actually look at as an exception. I mean, there are a few which are slightly better than the others. But as far as environmental policies are concerned, most countries in the world have extremely weak regulation. And the development trajectory that we have taken in the past 50 years, because most issues related to the environmental disasters today are reported from 1970 onwards. So it is exactly 50 years from which you have a lot of comparative data on how humans have eroded this buffer between themselves and the natural world. So this pandemic is a direct outcome of that destruction of nature. It has brought human beings in close proximity so that there is a spillover. This is a medical term that is used in pandemic parlance, that there is a spillover of microorganisms. And then in this context, it's a virus. The coronavirus itself is fairly old. It was discovered almost 20 years ago. And the first outcome was in 2001. And then the second was in 2013 in terms of an endemic. And then finally, the 20th year, it became a pandemic. So this erosion of the space between humans and the natural world has impacted in the creation or in the creation of opportunities for viruses to spill over from animals to human beings. So you would assume that any policy, future policy, would work to reinforce that buffer, reinforce that space, and to enrich the natural world itself, rather than make it even more destructive, rather than give it opportunities for human beings, give humans more opportunities to destroy this buffer even further. So it is about the timing. It's about the pandemic. It is also about the idea of development itself, because India, it seems, just like a lot of other countries, are pressed to ensure that the post-COVID economy, well, if you're talking very specifically about India, the economy was dwindling. I mean, even if you look at it purely from a conventional GDP point of view, we were quickly dropping the past 5-6 years, and then COVID happened, the pandemic happened. So the government is in a hurry, to frog leap back into higher GDP levels, and it believes that one of the ways of doing it is to curtail regulations, because most governments in the past 20 years have been in their political manifestos speaking about removing the license Raj, as it was called. The regulatory frameworks were put together and politically termed as an era of the license Raj. So most political parties in their manifestos were very clear about removing them. And now, with the hurry of jumping back to higher GDP numbers, the government seems to believe that diluting environmental laws will make FDIs and such other development opportunities possible, and much more quickly. The fourth aspect of it was or is the lack of imagination in terms of what is usually called the green economy. And I have spoken about it quite a bit because India, amongst a lot of other countries in the global south, seem to have woken up late on this aspect called the green economy. What is green economy? I mean, green economy is being able to create job opportunities to ensure that there are livelihoods all across the country in a manner that you don't destroy, that you don't have to get destructive and expropriative as far as nature is concerned. We know that the lifestyle that we've adopted over many decades, and in the US it has been the post-Second World War, and India after the liberalization process, the culture of conspicuous consumption is inherent to this development model. So the more you consume, the better the GDP, and that's the development model. And the green economy, though not an extremely radically, though not radically different from the mainstream economy, it is definitely a lot more greener in terms of its impact on the environment itself. And India seems to be one of the countries which has missed out on opportunities to build on the green economy infrastructure, the governance architecture too. Just to kind of give you a sense of time and scale, you had a green economy discussed in mainstream academics 40 to 45 years ago in the West. So they were already trying to bring in an understanding, an academic understanding and a policy understanding of how a green economy would look. We have not been able to do that here. So this is the first set of contexts which I would want to express. The first is on the timing of the notification. Second is the pandemic itself, having caused because of an Anthropocene era where the humans have impacted nature quite a bit, and there's been a spillover of microorganisms from what has to be wildlife to humans. And so you would expect future policies to repair, such an erosion of physical as well as social boundaries between the wildlife and human beings. The third was on the concept of development itself. And the fourth, of course, is the green economy space. Because of the background that I come from, which is at the interface between academics on one side and policy advocacy, policy drafting, and direct action on the other, can bring in a perspective which is informed from both sides. So I don't claim to be neutral at all, but I don't want to be vindictive in terms of just one regime or the other. Because if you look at the EIA, the Environmental Impact Assessment process, India as a country was never serious about it. And there are records to show that 99% of proposals have been approved. And you can imagine the quality of due diligence adopted by successive governments, by different governments, in a hurry to approve proposals, development projects and proposals. And 99% of them have been approved. I hear there are actually more than 99%. And I also hear that from members, EIA members, because there's a committee at the state level, at the national level, to evaluate proposals. And I have heard stories from members of the EIA committee of how much it has been a sham, that this is just a facade and a ritual, than an actual rigorous process of looking at the environmental impact of the proposed project. And this I'm able to share with you because of this interface that I have been at, looking at academics as well as direct action. So it is really not just about EIA 2020. It's about how committed we are as a country to this extremely important international process called the EIA, because almost 180 countries have EIA as a policy, and some countries are better than the others. In this context, I would also want to say that in reality, in 2018, India, in its Environmental Performance Indicator, as it's called, EPI, dropped 40 positions. The global environmental performance indicator, India dropped 40 positions to 177 of the 180 countries. So this was 2018. And from 2016 to 18, in just about 2 years' time, the dilution of various policies, environmental policies, the Water Act, the Air Act, the Conservation Act of 1980, the Wildlife Act, such things. The dilution of these laws, as well as curtailing the ability of existing institutions like the National Green Tribunal to function, meant that India dropped almost 40 positions on the Environment Performance Indicator. Ironically, the EPI, the Environment Performance Indicator, is identified by an extremely neoliberal and capitalistic forum at the Davos in Switzerland. So the EPI, the EP index is not done by an independent body of progressively oriented people. Indeed, it is done by extremely capitalistic platform, which meets at the Davos every year. And even they deemed that India's performance as far as the environment is concerned is extremely bad. And if you say 177 out of 180, you might as well say that we are at the very bottom of all the nations in the world, 180 nations in the world, which have signed up to such an to be measured based on such an indicator. We are at the very bottom of it all. As well as the fact that, you know, the previous the previous law of EIA, which was done in 2006, 14 years ago, can also be critiqued for having diluted the earlier provisions of the EIA. Right? Now, why should we be concerned? We should be concerned because India, for the first time in its 5-year plans, see, India, when we came out of the colonial yoke, at least the direct colonial yoke of the British in 1947, and then when we became a republic, and then adopted the 5-year plan methods for our planning, for what was called nation building at that particular time, did not talk about the environment for almost 20 years, 25 years. It was only in the 1960s, late 1960s, that environment was even mentioned in our planning documents, which only meant that we have started late as far as looking at development from an environmental dimension is concerned. We started late. And I was sharing with another set of students that it is the 4th 5-year plan when something called the harmonious development was mentioned for the first time in India. So this harmony or the harmonious development is important because it can be argued through various means. And EIA, the Environmental Impact Assessment, is also an outcome of what is largely understood as development as given, a development trajectory as a given trajectory. But in that process of being able to perform or achieve these, this development trajectory, that you should also ensure that there is a harmony between our development plans and the environment. It's a gray area there. It can be debated in various ways, but even to say harmony between nature and development targets came in only in the 4th 5-year plan in the late 1960s. And it is often said that Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, who is credited with the achievement of starting the Environment Ministry for the first time. We did not even have an Environment Ministry. And the mainstream narrative says that he was influenced by the Chipko movement. And leaders like Sundarlal Bahuguna were able to influence upon Indira Gandhi to start an environmental department, environmental ministry in the government of India. So she was an extremely sensitive prime minister on issues of environment. Obviously, this can be critiqued. This is one way of looking at it. So EIA came much later, after many other countries adopted it, and after a discussion about EIA in an international convention. So it is because of this international or global pressure that India also adopted EIA, and it took almost 10 years for the government of India to actually formulate rules for the implementation of EIA from the time it agreed to create EIA as a governance process in India. It took about 10 years. So that talks a lot about the lack of commitment on the part of the government of India from a very long time ago. You must also know that EIA is a subordinate legislation. I really do not know how many of you understand, these legal vocabulary, but a subordinate legislation is one which does not necessarily require debates and discussions in the parliament. because certain ministries have been empowered to draft and to okay a law before they bring it to the parliament. And this was a British practice because it was decided that all issues cannot be discussed in the parliament for lack of time. And so certain departments and certain elected representatives would be empowered to coordinate with their senior bureaucrats to create a law. So EIA is also one such law which has not been debated and discussed and approved in the parliament. Right? It's a subordinate law made at the level of the ministry. I assume that it was also a matter of convenience as well as the creation of a deliberate loophole at the governance level to make it a subordinate law, because something as important as the environment has to be discussed in the parliament. But they chose to make it a subordinate law to be decided, discussed, debated at the level of the ministry itself, right? I feel this is a huge loophole in the very creation of this law. And I think it's important for us to understand, the legacy of EIA before we actually go and critique it as such. So this is the level of commitment, a very low level of commitment through which this was promulgated and implemented. It took 10 years time, and even after the rules were formed, almost 99% or more than 99% of projects were approved. Very few which were not approved. And the members themselves feel that it is a sham. I cannot vouch for it as an insider, but this is an insider's view that it is all a sham. So many people have resigned from these committees because they have not been able to keep up with the practice of a very callous manner in which these things got approved. It is also the fact that the process itself was largely under duress, meaning there was a lot of sense of insecurity and fear amongst marginal communities in villages or in forests under which public consultations have happened. So it is common in the news that you see, and this is how it has been forever, right? And it is common news, and you may have read this so many times, that you actually have the police in most of these public discussions. I do not see armed police and the role of the armed police in a public discussion, in a town hall discussion. But this only reflects the duress or this culture of fear under which most of these public discussions have happened in the EIA so far. This is where we arrive at the law itself, 2006, and then now the 2021. See, governments, especially in the global south, and I don't think we should let of this pattern, have largely tried to adopt the Western ways of making laws and policies, instead of ensuring that our own knowledge base is developed, instead of ensuring that there are enough platforms and opportunities for people in India to contribute to the policy of policy making. We are largely drawn our model from the West. So before we understand we try and understand environmental laws. There are many laws which, and I'm not going to talk about the laws in detail because that's not the point here. Before the laws came the principles. These are international environmental principles. So to understand something like the EIA, we need to go back to the environmental principles. And the principles themselves are so very important because it's not the governments of the world which have decided on these principles, but these have been civil society organizations, activists, and researchers who've contributed to the emergence of principles. And none of these environmental principles have happened at the same time. So which means that people's experiences, research methodologies, outcomes of certain projects and approaches, development approaches, have at various times led to the creation or articulation of different principles. For example, the a very well-known environmental principle of the day is something called the proximity principle. The proximity principle is a fairly recent principle in comparison to prevention principles. And I will explain this so you understand this well. The prevention principle or preventive measures to be taken as as a principle to ensure your environmental laws are implemented well or environmental laws are being promulgated well was very clear. It's about preventing the known outcome of a certain process. You know that creating a Bhopal gas Union Carbide company, methyl isocyanate is very dangerous. So the prevention principle only spoke about how to ensure that you prevent an adversarial outcome, a destructive outcome of a known process, which meant that it was agreed that we require methyl isocyanate to be manufactured. However dangerous it is, it was decided that we need it, but we need to prevent a negative outcome in the process of making it. That was the prevention aspect of it. Obviously, we did not implement it well. I mean, that's why Bhopal gas tragedy is still the worst industrial accident in the world ever. It has killed more people than Chernobyl has. Though Chernobyl as a nuclear plant exploding, the core of the nuclear plant exploding might be more dramatic in nature, but it was in a distant place compared to the Union Carbide company, which is at the center of Bhopal. Yeah. So the preventive principle existed, but the proximity principle came later. The point that I'm trying to make is that laws are an outcome of principles. So without understanding the principles, you cannot understand the laws. Can you hear me? I just got a notification that I cannot unmute myself because the host has muted you. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, you're audible. Yes, sir.
Okay. Right. So I will not take much time on this. But then, the proximity principle was about ensuring that, you limit the, the outcome, the negative outcome of a development process within a certain limit, within a certain jurisdiction. So if, for example, in an modern urban setting, and because of a consumption pattern, we're creating waste and garbage, that this garbage should be managed locally. So you don't need dump yards outside the city, and you're not only polluting the microclimate of villages around the dump. You're also criminalizing any resistance to the dump itself, right? So so the proximity principle was about, look, if you pollute, you have to manage it in the local jurisdiction. This was based on a governance understanding called the subsidiarity principle, which means that the best possible decisions are those that are made at the lowest and the most local entity possible. That's the subsidiarity principle in a democracy. So the proximity principle took about 20 years to 25 years after the preventive principles were evolved. Right? So these principles took time, and people like you and me have contributed to the creation of these principles. Midway between the prevention and the proximity principle came what is called the polluter pay principle. And polluter pay principle need not be elaborated because it's namesake as well as it's self-explanatory. The polluter pays for it, right? To repair a certain pollution. Let's look at this from the point of view of what is happening right now in Mauritius. A Japanese oil tanker got marooned. It hit a reef. Almost for 7 to 10 days, it was just there. It started toppling and then it started cracking. And only yesterday, it started spilling oil into the ocean. And Mauritius, as an archipelago, a series of islands, is an extremely sensitive biodiversity hotspot in the world. And you've got a Japanese tanker from thousands of miles away, which comes to Mauritius, gets marooned, and it starts leaking. Who's responsible for it? I mean, can you, in the international courts, hold the government of Japan accountable for this? Obviously, you cannot, because it's going to be challenged. It's a private entity, it's a private company, and the government of Japan can always wash its hands away and say, look, we are not part of it, right? So all these principles are very, very pertinent to argue for and on behalf of the environment. So EIA included, all environmental laws are based on evolving principles. So you can have a separate set of principles tomorrow. If you think you've got the content for an argument, you can always push in for a set of principles, which will then be used to make newer laws, environmental laws. Why is this important? Why is it important for us to understand that you've got environmental principles which create the bedrock on which the environmental laws are created? Is because, number one, you yourself can bring about a change. We might now be challenged by the EIA notification of 2020, but this is not the end of the world. This is not the end of politics, and this is not the end for your own sense of agency being able to create a change. So to know principles is to also understand that you can articulate for better principles and even use this EIA 2020 as an opportunity to push for more logic and more principles to ensure that the EIA doesn't get diluted. Yeah, that's number one. Number two, it is important for us to understand environmental principles also because governments around the world are not only trying to do away with the laws, environmental laws, and dilute them, they are trying to change the principles themselves. And one of the main things is to ensure that en masse, you remove all these principles and from a development understanding, push for just one principle to take care of all the others. And that principle is called the principle of self-regulation. So governments of the day believe that you can do away with all the principles of all the environmental principles that have evolved and so well articulated over decades, do away with all of them, and bring in the development angle to push for just one principle, which is called the principles of self-regulation, which is about letting the company or any business entity which is proposed a huge project and is running a huge project to regulate themselves. How well it will work is understood by an analogy saying that how about giving the keys to the robber or to the thief? I was sharing with my other students at NLS and I was saying that you wouldn't even want to give your house keys to the police. I mean, imagine an area, a residential area, and people from all the houses in the residential area decide to keep their keys at the police. You would do that, right? But self-regulation is a kind of principle which is talking about providing your house keys to the robber, to the thief. Yeah, and that's essentially why it's very important for us to look at EIA not just as a law and not just a process of diluting the law, but to also look at the principles of which are being attacked. So if there's a parliamentary committee in your own country which is trying to review environmental laws, it becomes your ardent responsibility to look at the TOR, the terms of reference of the review of, which has been tasked to the committee to see what they're supposed to do. And most such committees which look at, which are asked to review environmental laws are also given the responsibility to review the principles. What does it mean? It means if the principles are the bedrock or the foundation on which the environmental laws are framed, by removing the principles, you're essentially removing the foundation of a building, which will collapse. So you can see that there is a very sustained attack across the world to dilute the principles and thereby making the laws ineffective. So EIA 2006 as well as 2020 should also be looked at from this viewpoint. You've already learned quite a bit about EIA 2020, but you must also know, if you already don't, that the 2006 EIA has also been amended 43 times in the last 14 years. 43 times. There have been more than 60 notifications, which if put together run into more than 400 pages. So there's a voluminous of, effort to dilute even the 2006 notification by successive governments. So the 2020 notification is at the epitome of all this, because it is built on successive dilutions of the EIA of 2006. So you really cannot be biased in your finger pointing as far as the governments are concerned. You could only take a stand on behalf of the environment irrespective of the government. Because between 2006 and 2014, you had another government. You had UPA 1 and UPA 2, and we were able to successively push for, laws like the National Green Tribunal Act of 2010, which is still, regarded as an extremely important piece of legislation on environmental governance. And people of all kind agree upon the need for something like the NGT. We were also able to push for laws in that period between 2006 and 2014, environmental laws with social dimension, very strong social dimension, like the Forest Rights Act, right? And the Forest Rights Act was also a cultural act to a large extent, because till then the practice was, especially with the Wildlife Act and the Conservation Act and the National Parks Act, the practice was to target forest dwelling indigenous communities, because the urban understanding of the forest was something that has to be devoid of humans in it, and all humans, though they are indigenous in nature, are to be removed from there. I mean, that was the culture. So the Forest Rights Act took an extremely different approach to this. It's to first of all acknowledge that people have lived and contributed to the conservation of forests for thousands of years. And in this part of India, I mean, I'm speaking from Bangalore, and I also see that there are participants from other parts of South India. The indigenous communities in the Western Ghats are Proto-Dravidian communities. There is so much of talk about the Dravidian movement and like, I mean, however important that may be. The fact is that there have been cultures here which are Proto-Dravidian. Proto-Dravidian is in the formation of being Dravidian, so pre-Dravidian. Yeah. Jainu Nudi, the language which is spoken by the Kuruba community, these are communities that herd bees. And Jainu Nudi is a pre-Dravidian language and a pre-Dravidian culture. Same thing with Koraga Nudi, which is in the coastal part of Karnataka in the Western Ghats area. So there have been the communities have been there for thousands of years in their own culture. And the Forest Rights Act for the first time acknowledged the fact that they've been here and they've been contributing to into the conservation of the forest. And you should ensure that their entitlement over the forest, see, it's not a private property. As you know, FRA, the Forest Rights Act doesn't give out private property. Forest is private property. But it gives an entitlement for people over forests, both at the individual level and at the community level, because there are cultures of things like Devara Kadu and the rest, which are about community commons, foresters commons, which community rights have been provided. And I have been part of processes of implementing FRA with all the challenges that it has, and ensured that a large number of people have been provided this entitlement. I mean, the last count when I left my previous organization was almost 26,000 acres of forest, which have been provided as entitlements to people who are dwelling there, of course, with the limits of the FRA. So while such progressive laws like the FRA and the NGT was being promulgated and created, EIA was successively being diluted, because EIA is directly influenced by interests, largely corporate interests. And the corporate interests in a country like India, these are huge corporate interests. And there is also demand from investors from abroad for such regulations to be diluted, regulatory laws to be diluted. So it was from 2006 to now, there have at least been 43 successful amendments to dilute the law. To the time we arrive at this juncture, where the government believes that we can allow for companies to regulate their own activities, that there is no need for a strong regulatory governance infrastructure or architecture to keep looking at what these companies do. We should trust them and ensure that our regulatory framework is based on this trust over a private company. So every aspect of this change is based on primarily this understanding that you can believe and trust the company to regulate themselves. Right? So I would intervene by giving 3 or 4 aspects of this new law, which are especially concerning. The first is participation, because participatory principle is also one of the principles of democracy, not just about environmental lawmaking, but even environmental lawmaking, participatory principle is one of the most powerful principles. Participation is about information on one end, having the entire information on one end, to be able to take a decision on a proposed project on the other. So this law or this dilution or this amendment in the notification seem to curtail both. There will not be information provided for a whole lot of projects which are deemed strategic in nature, and you can have more and more sectors coming into what is strategic for that matter. Now, so on the information front, there would be complete, a block of information, of access, blocking of access to information on one side, and a dilution of people's ability to make a choice, because there are a whole lot of projects today, whole lot of sectors today, as promoted by EIA 2020, which should be outside the ambit of people's participation. So the prior informed consent of the people has been done away with a law, for a lot of projects. So this entire participatory principle has been completely diluted. For me, I think more than anything else, more than even the outcome of a certain project, which can always be discussed, for me, I think for the quality of democracy that a society would want to build, for the depth of democracy that you would envisage in the future for your own country, people's ability to know and to participate would be extremely important. And this EIA attacks this principle of people's participation. So it keeps people in the dark as far as many projects are concerned. Number 2, it for some reason, because the very facts that you have something called the EIA is to promote what was called the harmonious growth, harmony between humans and their development requirements in terms of their impact on environment. So when this is why EIA was created. Can you allow for industries to initiate their development projects without a clearance? This particular law allows for what is called an ex post facto clearance, where you start an industry and suddenly realize that, after a while, you suddenly realize that you've not taken an appointment, you've not taken a clearance certificate, and then you apply. And the government allows for something like this with a little bit of penalty. It's 5,000 rupees per day is the penalty that it talks about. And so let's assume that there is a mining company with tens of crores of interests. Would they actually be bothered to let go of 1,50,000 rupees per month? It hardly matters. Okay, about 16 lakh rupees or 18 lakh rupees per year is the penalty
penalty that they need to pay if they've not already taken a clearance. I mean, this is, it's flabbergasting if you want to look at an expression, to connote your lack of understanding for something like this, your surprise for something like this. It's flabbergasting. Obviously, it is destructive in nature. It allows for an ex post facto clearance. So the LG polymers, which exploded in Visakhapatnam and killed 12 or 14 people, and I think also many hundreds were hospitalized. Had applied for clearance, post facto clearance, and the hearing was exactly 10 days before it exploded. And it is said that they were operating for 15 years without a clearance for the extension that they did, the factory, for 15 years. This law will legitimize such processes. The oil field of Oil India Limited in Assam, which exploded, and there are still fires in that area, an extremely biosensitive area, has also been found to be in operation without a clearance for 12 years. With certain provisions which are getting diluted, but there's also the implementation phase which is not happening. So there's no commitment to to implement EIA. So the current government takes an extremely pragmatic approach and almost seems to say that, look, anyway you're not implementing it, so why have it at all? Let's have self-regulation. Let's curtail the abilities of business interest to invest in sensitive areas. Go away with the principles altogether. Anyway, they're not working. That's a pragmatic approach, and I'm sure this logic works in the minds of many. Because if you look at the many articles in especially business papers, they're saying exactly this. They're saying that, look, EIA is not working. They do not say it is not working because it is not being implemented well. They say it is not working, so it's become a burden, and hence it can be done away with. So that's a logic, for the formulation of EIA 2020. The other very disturbing aspect of this EIA is the violations. There seems to be, in my reading of the regulation of the notification, there seems to be an attempt to take away people's entitlement to complain a violation and allow only for government representatives, meaning bureaucrats and the others, to do the inspection and to report for violations. This goes against our constitutional responsibility. I mean, there are specific articles in the Constitution which provides rights to citizens to ensure that they are part of the protection and the conservation and the management of commons, of nature. Now, if the government is attempting to take away this right of people to complain a violation, then you're curtailing the constitutional rights of that individual. So in a lot of ways, this is also not just untimely and inappropriate, it is also unconstitutional in that frame of mind, in that frame of analysis. So lastly, one of the ways you can compare this to the Right to Information Act, which also happened during UPA 1, and that is why it is quite ironic that you came out with something as positively detrimental is an inexplicable irony of UPA 1 and UPA 2. Now, one of the things that the current government has done to make right to information ineffective is to have a direct control over the appointments of officers at the state level and to limit their tenure. So which means that you're centralizing the decision making as far as the tenureship of bureaucrats who are responsible for the operationalization of an act and having a direct control over their operations. So you can, for example, assume that such loopholes will allow for not seniority, but for people, for the government to remove anyone it deems is not fit to promote their agenda. So they can always have someone who will push their agenda. And so from the time, and for people who have worked on the RTI issue, they can tell you that it is becoming more and more difficult in these years to access information. See, Karnataka as a state was identified as being very progressive in RTI implementation, just like the Panchayati Raj implementation, RTI in implementation. So I have experienced a sense of entitlement going to a government office and getting information under the act. And that sense of entitlement is becoming more and more diffuse in these years because the junior officer at the department level knows that I cannot do anything even if he or she doesn't provide me information, because the entire process, operational process, has been diluted. And the same thing is being attempted through IA to loosen out and diffuse the environmental governance architecture in the entire country. There are many aspects that we can talk about in terms of what huge projects going for post facto clearance will have an impact locally, right? But that is not the point. We all know about it. We also know that, the Prime Minister today, today's Prime Minister has, from an international politics point of view, because Malaysia, the government of Malaysia raised certain objections to Indian policies related to Kashmir and other places. And obviously we are a sovereign country and the government will respond to an external government responding, questioning our policies. So the government retaliated, the government of India retaliated and said, we are going to reduce the import of palm oil from Malaysia. Now, it is going to directly hit Malaysia, and Malaysia has completely destroyed its tropical forest because it's an equatorial, Malaysia, if you know, it's an equatorial country. Now, thick with forests. And they've done away with forests and planted palm, plantations. Now, these palm plantations have had disastrous consequences in Malaysia. And they've been selling us palm oil, and palm oil is the cheapest oil that's available in the market. And India decides not to take that oil. It affects Malaysia, of course. But where does India suffice its own palm oil requirements? So it was told last week that the Prime Minister of India has decided to promote palm plantation in the Northeast. Northeast is the northern extension of Malaysia. You've got Malaysia, you've got Thailand, you've got Myanmar, and then you've got India. Thick with forests, and eastern Himalayas, where the Northeast is one of the 18 biodiversity hotspots in the world. You've got in India only 2 biodiversity hotspots. One is in Western Ghats, the other is the Eastern Himalayas, which stretches towards Northeast India. And now the government of India wants to clear those forests and start planting palm trees for the sake of palm oil. So we don't have to be dependent on Malaysia for palm oil. So those projects are going to be cleared very, very, very easily through EIA, because they will be considered strategic in nature, because it's about international politics, it's about national security, they will claim, and those will be cleared more easily. And you will not even have information about it. As far as the EIA notification goes, it very clearly says that there is no need for the information for strategic projects will not be provided, right? So this is where we are at right now. And today is supposed to be the last day for the submission of feedback. And though initially it was just in Hindi and English, and the time was limited to June, the courts intervened and said, look, you have to extend it. So it was extended to the 11th of August. And it was also printed in a lot of other documents. I mean, I, for one, know that I'm not aware of it being translated to Kannada. That's a language of the states. I mean, it's a major language of the states in Karnataka. There are also many minor languages. And so it was just in Hindi and English initially, and now in some other 5 or 6 languages after the courts intervened. One positive aspect of it all, before I end, was the response of the Minister for Environment and Forest, Mr. Prakash Javadekar, yesterday. And but from the tone of it, it appeared that they have understood a democratic uproar against EIA notification. People of various sectors and walks of life have used creative ways to oppose EIA. So the minister, who just a fortnight ago had written an extremely terse response to the earlier Environment Minister, Mr. Jairam Ramesh, who also is a chairperson of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Environment and Forests, who is on record saying that when the committee met, when the standing committee met, the ruling party members wouldn't even want to discuss the EIA. They said, what is the point discussing the EIA? So the chairperson said, of course there's a point, because it's a piece of law, and which directly is about the standing committee's mandate, which is Environment and Forest, and we have to discuss. And he said it was a very positive discussion that he had with the ruling party. But he's an opposition party, but he's also the chairperson of the standing committee. That's how democracy works beautifully. Now, so this terse response that Prakash Javadekar gave to Jairam Ramesh a fortnight ago seemed to have changed in the tone that he's used yesterday. He said, why are people threatened by it? I mean, it is just a notification. We have not finalized it. We will take more time and more inputs before we finalize it. And he says, of all the lakh and odd responses that have come, that he will try and respond to all of them. And he says there's no need for any worry as such. But the tone itself seems to be a lot more diluted and defensive compared to the terse response earlier, which I think is the outcome of a functional democracy, which still, I mean, you can review it, you can critique it in various ways, and dwindling space for democracy and the rest. But still, this, the outcome of EIA will reflect on the quality of democracy in India, if indeed this gets shelved altogether. And the demand for a parliamentary law, not a subordinate legislation, but a parliamentary law on environment based on the principles of harmonious development, be enacted instead of EIA 2020. Yeah, so you use this opportunity to demand for a parliamentary law, which is based on science and the demands of climate change, because these are times of climate change, so you cannot ignore it and make a policy which contributes to climate change further. As a matter of fact, Jairam Ramesh has written to the government and said, look, if you posture that you're very progressive environmentally in the international realm, you know, the Prime Minister of India has also got an international award on environmental conservation. So he said, if you hold on to that posture at the international level, but are hell-bent on breaking down environmental laws and principles within the country, you're being two-faced. You're being two-faced. And this is going to be exposed sooner or later, is what he says in one of his speeches, Jairam Ramesh. But I'm very happy that people have contributed and the ministry has responded, and in the most recent defensive manner in which it has responded. I feel that this pressure has seemed to have worked, and we need to know how indeed it will be able to impact a change in the next few days. So I will end here. I know that there are phenomenal activists. I saw their names here, and with immense experience who can contribute to the discussion. So I will end here, and then if you have questions, I will respond.
Thank you, sir. In case of questions, the questions may please be typed into the chat box. And while the questions come, sir, a doubt from my own side. One of the major criticisms against this particular draft notification were regarding taking away the role of indigenous population, especially in the Northeast. Regarding that front, what would be your opinion? Because especially in the policy making era now, participatory methods are being promoted in the policy making intellectual era, but the notification on paper is actually taking away the rights of people to even complain against a company when it is offending.
Yeah, you'll have to unmute me. Huh? Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, you're audible.
Okay. See, I think, Rajashree, we need to understand that there are not many pieces of law in India which specifically talk about indigenous communities. You know, there's an attempt to standardize the population, right? So the Forest Rights Act was, one such legislation which spoke about indigenous communities as such. But around environmental law or environmental decision making, there is one law which is extremely important, and that law is called PESA. PESA is an acronym for Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act. Scheduled areas are where you have indigenous people who are identified under the constitution. And because you don't have panchayats there, you have the PESA. And the PESA Act, the Act of PESA, the Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act, empowers indigenous communities locally to take a call on issues. It's a very progressive law. It's an extremely progressive law. And I see one of my friends from Nepal participating in this event. I do not know if they have similar laws in Nepal, but in India, I think we should appreciate that it exists, PESA exists. So if indigenous people in the Northeast or elsewhere are impacted by the environmental law of a project, they can always invoke PESA to defend themselves, right? So that provision exists. But EIA itself is diluted and doesn't talk necessarily about indigenous people separately. Yeah, so the social hegemony of the governance thought process has to be understood well, because indigenous communities are indigenous communities. I mean, their requirements, their lifestyle, their cultures are very, very different compared to the others. So unless, I mean, Canada, the Prime Minister in Canada, the Prime Minister has been openly speaking about indigenous culture and trying to include in Canadian laws aspects of indigenous culture. And even in India, we should have that. But otherwise, EIA is going to decimate indigenous communities in the Northeast. And Jairam Ramesh has also spoken about the many representations he's got from the Northeast on how.
I have enabled audio for all participants in case the questions are complicated to type here. So you may please unmute yourself and ask the questions.
Yeah, hello.
Yes, you're audible.
Yeah, so can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Yeah, this is Andrew. I work in Andhra Pradesh Planning Department. Yeah, my
Yes,
question is actually there are like you have mentioned a couple of principles like polluter pay principle, proximity principle, these sort of principles. But I wonder, I mean, my reading is that these principles only help us sort of manage a problem. Instead of producing it here, it makes us produce there, or it sort of lowers the impact. But how about any sort of discussion or a principle that addresses production in a very initial stage? Let's say a company after R&D goes to the patent. Can we put checks and balances on the patent level so that the production itself is sort of checked in the environmental perspective?
Yes, Andrew.
Is there any sort of discussion or principle available across the globe, especially EU or something?
Yeah. See, you can see that one such principle, which is called the precautionary principle, was indeed invoked, when we discussed BT Brunjol. In the case of BT Brunjol,
yeah,
it was, there was a public hearing. There were 5 to 6 public hearings held by the then minister. And the precautionary principle was finally adopted, because when he heard, the minister of that day heard out, research scientists on one side, the corporate entities on the other, and environmental organizations, he finally decided that he will invoke the precautionary principle, because there is not enough explanation, scientific explanation, on the impact of BT Brinjal. And that's when you invoke something called the precautionary principle and say that because we don't know much about it, we will not take a risk. So even before it starts, you stop the project. So there have been many instances, and I don't think even the principle like the proximity principle should be disregarded, because coming from a planning department, you will know that in an urban area, the ward committees are a constitutional mandate, but they are not happening across India. It is not happening in Andhra. So the ward committees, along with the corporator or the councillor, will be the lowest level of decision making.
Yeah.
And in the rules of your 74th Amendment, they will very clearly define roles at that local level. So you can indeed take care of a lot of things locally. From garbage disposal to decisions on water, on encroachments, and a lot of things are all defined in the rules of the law or the 74th Amendment.
Yeah.
So the proximity principle would then mean the ward committee level, the lowest level.
Okay.
And that's the point.
Well, what about the industrial production, especially? Let's say the future will be all about the batteries, mining and all these things. Production, especially chemical productions. Can we have any sort of checks and balance at the patent stage itself? Does the precautionary principle look after this?
Yeah, see, ideally it should. But you also raised an important question, because when you talk about alternatives to fossil fuel,
you are getting into EVs and such other things, solar and the rest. Now,
Yeah.
we have come a full circle in understanding alternatives. When I say we have come a full circle, I mean that there is a critique which has emerged, an informed critique that has emerged on the effects of, let's say, lithium-ion batteries.
Yeah.
Or the life time of a solar plant or a photovoltaic cell is just about 10 years.
Yeah.
So what happens to photovoltaic cells after 10 years? Because it's heavy metal in the photovoltaic cell. So there is a body of literature which has now emerged, which is critiquing what is being suggested as alternatives.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we are at that particular juncture where it is being critiqued, but there is no doubt that we need to move away from fossil fuel.
Yes.
So how will we balance the need for us to get away from fossil fuel, but still have a consistent source of being able to provide energy for human requirements, whether it could be transport, it could be electricity, and the rest. And this has to happen, and EIA should initiate such processes rather than curtail discussions.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
If there are
Thanks,
any more questions, you may please unmute yourself and ask the question.
Hello, sir. Good afternoon.
Yes.
Myself, Parvati. First of all, thank you so much, sir, for finding time to spend with us, because I'm not a law student, and I'm a chemistry graduate, but I could easily understand even the complicated things that was giving out through the news and all. So thank you so much, sir. So as soon as the EIA 2020 draft was published to the news, there were multiple kind of opinions, and like most of us like protested against it, but there were a few who was pointing out towards the benefits that could happen to the EIA 2020 draft. Like they were saying, like it is obviously giving job opportunities that can indeed come through Skill India. It's like if factories are there, then jobs are there for the people of India. So people were supposed, or they were forced to hold on to two contradictory beliefs, something kind of a double think case. So my question is this situation leading to a reality control in the name of development that is hiding all over?
Yeah, that's Parvati. Thanks, and I'm glad that being a chemistry student, you're still able to understand what is being discussed, because this is this is a discussion which also has laws and policies and such things, and obviously this has to be simplified that everyone understands, so everyone understands. So I'm glad you're understanding this. Number two, the point is very important. You're talking about job creation, and this is exactly why I brought in the concept of green economy. And the potentials of green economy has never been debated to its fullest extent in India. So in the US, there are some Democrats as well as private Congress people who are trying to push for a larger discussion on a complete transition away from fossil fuel into a green economy mode without losing jobs. As a matter of fact, creating more jobs.
Okay.
So if you look at the equation from an academic point of view, analysis being done, very clearly it is being said that the green economy future will create more jobs than the fossil fuel jobs.
Okay.
Right? And we need to understand this better and debate it much more. So the creation of jobs and livelihoods are usually red herrings to divert our attention away from the main topic. And the main topic today is EIA.
Yes.
Right? And the balance, the harmonious development process. rather than say that, look, I'm going to dilute the EIA or I'm going to create jobs of environmental impact assessment or the environment itself. Yeah, that's the crux of the topic, rather than getting ourselves misdirected towards what is being proposed as job creation and the rest. So
Yes.
I mean, just to conclude on this, there was a similar argument made when they started promoting huge infrastructure. Like for example, you have a city like Cochin, which has a metro, and I was approached by the Assistant Chief Secretary of Kerala, who was almost retiring, and he was in charge of the metro building in Kerala, and he was of the opinion that it was not required in Kerala, I mean in Cochin, but still they pushed it because of the mainstream dogma of huge infrastructure creating more jobs.
Okay.
Finally, it was analyzed that these huge mega projects created way less number of jobs compared to what was being promoted. Okay, and they even compared it to agriculture, and they said, per acre of irrigated land can create more jobs than 1 crore rupees projects at the mega level.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so 1 acre of irrigated land can create more jobs than big infrastructure projects.
Okay.
Okay, and so we need to start analyzing this for what they propose.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Thanks.
Sir, a question has been typed into the chat box. What actions can citizens take to make bureaucrats do a legitimate EIA?
See, one thing is that it's a little too late today, because unless, of course, you go back and write to the writes to the minister, the environment minister, Mr. Prakash Javadekar, and his bureaucrats, and his email ID is you should write to them and oppose this. But one of the other ways is, look, it's going to come to the level of discussion at the parliament, because definitely the opposition party are going to raise this when the. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah. Okay. So when this issue is definitely going to be raised by the opposition leaders when the parliament meets next. So if you can also not just write to the the minister opposition to it, but also ensure that you speak to your own elected representatives, the MPs in your towns and cities, to ensure that they raise the issue at the parliament. It's going to be a formidable force against something as dangerous as the EIA notification 2020. So please also talk to your elected representatives.
Is that the end of questions? Do we have any more questions?
Hello, good afternoon, sir.
Yeah, hi.
Hi, this is Gauri. I work as a consultant to Andhra Pradesh Pollution Control Board. Recently, I was associated in working for the report for the LG Polymers gas leak case, the High Power Committee report. And when we were preparing the report, we came across several regulatory gaps that there were between the central level and the state level, such as giving clearances is the responsibility of the state, while the state do not have such cases. So with such a backdrop of lack of clarity in responsibilities, how can we go ahead with EIA?
Yeah, see, Gauri, see, this issue, I feel is not coincidental. The confusion in the implementation of environmental laws, I feel, is very deliberate in nature.
Mhm.
And that is exactly why I said you cannot target one government for critique, because this confusion has lasted for a long time, and many governments have contributed to creating more and more confusion to ensure that the people themselves don't find. Even bureaucrats. You said you're a consultant at that level, and even you are not able to find the thread of continuity as far as who's responsible.
Absolutely.
Now, we need to look at the rules. We often stop at the level of the laws. We don't either look at the principles on which the laws are made, nor do we look at the rules, because it's only the rules that make the laws operational. You can make any law, but the law has to be implemented through rules. And depending on the subject matter, for example, the Water Act, initially the Water Act was what promoted the pollution control boards across India. Is a state act, now, so you have to look at how, and a lot of pollution control staff have often, because I also teach at the National Law School, and when they come to the National Law School in Bangalore, they say we are powerless, and we have to actually tell them that, look, according to this law and this rule, you have the power to make LG Polymers accountable, or other entities accountable. So there is a confusion on one side and a lack of willingness, political will amongst the local bureaucrats to implement the law in its fullest extent. So I suggest, if I can, to you, please look up the laws.
Okay.
Which govern. Please look up the rules of the laws that govern the Pollution Control Board in Andhra Pradesh. All the laws that govern Pollution Control Board, and then look at the rules of it. So you will find a space to make a change in those rules.
Sure. Thank you.
So we have another question. Why wouldn't international bodies such as the UN, whose principle is sustainable development, intervene in situations like these where our environment and its people are in great threat?
Yeah, it's interesting. All these questions are interesting because, these are what we've been pondering over. EIA is there. What is the international body doing? These are things that we are wondering, and I'm glad it's getting asked. None other than the Secretary General of the UN just 10 days ago spoke about the environment. He said, look, this pandemic is because of our inability as humans to balance between our development needs and environmental conservation. And I have not heard of any Secretary General at the UN level who has hit the nail on its head and so very clearly articulated the limitation of our growth pattern, the contemporary growth pattern. And this particular UN Secretary General has also made other progressive comments, which are highly commendable, right? So ability to make governments accountable, not in the international law. And that is why the US was able to walk away from the UN governed climate change conference. So the US was part of a conference in Paris, made promises according to the international conference demands. And then you had the new president, and the new president said, we are going to walk out of it. We are not going to match any of the targets that we have promised. We are not going to work to ensure that we meet the targets of any of the promises that we have made. So it just walked out of that UN process. And the US. And the US has also walked out of WHO, which has also been saying the same thing about the environmental dimension of public health. So we have a public health issue of global proportions, which has a direct relationship with the environment today. And so the WHO is talking about it. US walked out of WHO. US walked out of UN. So the UN cannot, in the law that it has, in the powers that it has, directly intervene, but has a limited mandate of advising. They can probably tell the government about sustainable development and its critique of EIA. It cannot stop India. So it's the people of India which needs, who will have to mobilize themselves to make a difference, not the UN. That was
Is that the
Rupika
end
Nair.
of questions? Yes. Do we have any more questions? So I think
I would even appreciate feedback if one or two of you can unmute yourself and just express your views of the conference. We are about less than half of the participants when we started, and obviously it's a 2-hour webinar, and it takes time, and people might have other appointments. But if you have anything to say in the form of a feedback, I will love that.
is there any more comments or questions or anything?
Yeah, good evening, sir. My name is
Piyush.
Piyush, and I'm a graduate from MAC from the media department. And I've had the opportunity to listen to you before as well. There is an NGO called Invest, and you were gracious enough to be there to talk about to give us a talk at one point of time. So this is my second time I'm actually listening to you, and I follow you on Facebook, and all I can say is it was a really informative session. Uh, I did not have to think a lot about the law itself, because I have come across the debates and discussions on the social media as well as on other portals, but I haven't had the time or the opportunity to actually go through the notification and the things that are actually mentioned there. But what you did here was not only talk about EIA, but gave us a perspective that will go a long way in telling us how should we approach such things, and not just EIA in particular. So yeah, I was really glad that I could be a part of this session. Thank you.
Thanks, Piyush. I remember you, and I hope we can meet again soon. After this COVID thing gets over.
Hopefully, sir. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, Rajashree.
Is that all? So thanks a lot, sir. First of all, for placing EIA within its historic and legal context, and then going further from there. That was a really informative session. And also for bringing forth the new idea that different from the normative, that economy and ecology are like opposing ideas, and that ecology has to be balanced for bettering the economy, or economy goes down once we focus on ecology. So for shifting from that idea of normative to bringing forth a new paradigm, and also for engaging in such an intellectually nourishing session. On behalf of KIETS and all the participants, I thank you, sir. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Best wishes. It was my pleasure being here. And hope together we'll be able to stop this notification. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.